From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. The U.S. pauses a shipment of bombs to Israel over concerns about civilian casualties in a potential Rafah invasion. We'll get reaction from former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, James Jeffrey. President Biden set to propose a new rule that would speed up deportations of some undocumented migrants seeking to claim asylum. Samara Klar, political science professor at the University of Arizona, will weigh in on how that could play in border states. Plus, Biden today visiting the key swing state of Wisconsin, highlighting a Microsoft investment in the same spot where a project announced during the Trump administration fizzled out. More with our political panel this hour. So a lot is ahead this evening, but we begin with the U.S. pausing that shipment of bombs to Israel as concerns mount over an invasion of Rafah. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin spoke about the situation in a hearing on Capitol Hill earlier today.
We've been very clear, Senator, as you know, from the very beginning that Israel shouldn't launch a major attack into Rafah without accounting for and protecting the civilians that are in that battle space. And again, as we have assessed the situation, we paused one shipment of high payload munitions.
Bloomberg's Akayla Gardner, who covers the White House, joins me now. So, Akayla, obviously this is a pause, not an outright cancellation at this point. The secretary did make that clear that no permanent decision on this matter has been made at this point when he was testifying today. But really just within the last hour, we have gotten some criticism from the Republican leaders of Congress, Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, out with a letter to the administration encouraging them to expedite aid to Israel. So this decision is not sitting well with everyone.
Absolutely. They said that they were alarmed by finding out this review was underplaced or underway, I should say. But this really underscores a broader tension that I've seen with Congress and the White House. They feel like they have not been looped in and notified when President Biden has made major military decisions, especially in the Middle East. But here you really have President Biden taking a step as we see Israel now going forward with this invasion of Rafah, despite the administration's concerns about the potential human suffering that could be caused to the more than 1 million refugees who are now there.
And of course, because of the concern around civilian life, the president is facing a great deal of domestic political pressure on the left, in addition to these pressures I was just speaking about on the right. He also has been receiving a lot of pressure from the right on the issue of the border, especially after the bipartisan deal that he negotiated with leaders in the Senate on the border fell through. There has been a lot of speculation that perhaps he might take executive action. We're learning this evening that he could announce tomorrow tweaks to asylum law. Akayla, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so one thing to note is this is not this big executive order that we could expect or the administration is still weighing to take on the border. This is a much smaller scale regulation that would basically impact the way that asylum seekers are screened, basically screening people for potential national security risk or safety risk that could expedite deportation by the time that they are in the U.S. So this is going to affect a relatively small group of people. But again, the administration has said they're going to take every route they possibly can to work on this issue. Now that, of course, that Senate bipartisan deal has stalled and pretty much fizzled out in the Senate.
Well, speaking of fizzling out, Akayla, we also had President Biden today visiting the key swing state of Wisconsin on the site where a project that was supposed to be launched by Foxconn to invest in the state fizzled out during the Trump administration after it was much heralded. The president was there today highlighting an investment that Microsoft is making, $3.3 billion into a facility there. So on the one hand, he's talking about manufacturing in the U.S. On the other, he's kind of poking his rival in November.
Yeah, he's definitely taking a poke at President Trump's legacy here. This was a site of where this Foxconn facility was supposed to be. Now it's Microsoft investing $3 billion in a potential artificial intelligence data center. And this is really Biden's way of sort of trying to get at some of the resentment that there is in middle America that really Trump ran on in 2016 and was successfully was able to tap into in that region. And he's really touting himself as this union guy, someone who supports manufacturing and who believes his investment and his agenda has really supported in the region. But time will only tell if we see this Microsoft facility and so many facilities across the country actually come to fruition as well.
All right, Bloomberg's Akayla Gardner running us through the many stories we are following in regard to the White House today. Thank you so much. Meanwhile, we're also following Congress as they're pushing the deadline for the FAA reauthorization down the road a week. The House voting this evening on that extension before leaving town for the weekend. Earlier, I spoke with Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia, who voiced optimism about this bill's ultimate passage.
I have been especially focused on the issue of bolstering our workforce pipeline. We have a shortage of pilots, aviation mechanics, other people who work in the industry, and we are barely pulling from all of our human talent. So I have provisions in the bill that address that along with other things, and I remain very hopeful that we'll get all of this over the finish line before the deadline come Friday.
Well, maybe that in particular isn't going to happen. Let's bring in Jack Fitzpatrick, who covers Congress for Bloomberg Government. So, Jack, he thought this could get done by the Friday deadline of May 10th. The House says, nope, let's deal with it by next Friday. Why? Did the timing just not work that this would have been able to make it through both chambers in time?
The timing didn't work. They were trying to negotiate a unanimous consent agreement in the Senate and allow for votes on certain amendments that some members wanted. And you can hold a vote quickly in the Senate if everybody agrees to bypass some procedural steps. As of right now, they seem to be lining up those procedural steps that would allow for a vote as soon as maybe Wednesday or Thursday of next week. So if you don't have unanimous consent, you can get something done in the Senate as long as you have 60 votes, but you can't really do it that quickly. Yeah. The House also, I think this is a sign that we're getting toward campaign season and people are a little tired of legislating. The House is taking their last votes of the week. There was the idea that the Senate would jam the House, send this over to the House and say, we're leaving town, you've got to pass it. Now the House is voting on or about to pass a 1-week extension and leaving town, which is essentially the House jamming the Senate and saying, we're going to take another week. Even if you send us this passed FAA bill, if you miraculously get it done soon, we'll be gone. So they're looking to take another week just because the Senate only moves slowly if everybody is on board very, very quickly.
Well, Jack, you mentioned how maybe there's some tire in legislating because it is campaign season. And because campaign season is really upon us now, there was talk about how this is the last legislative vehicle or train to leave the station, if you will. So a lot of this is people trying to attach amendments to this legislation, right? Do we have an idea ultimately which of those amendments could get through?
Well, there was a conversation about a lot of different amendments in an attempt to get some important things on there. But now, if you don't get unanimous consent for all of those amendments, you might end up with virtually nothing. The members who backed the tax bill that had the child tax credit measure and other things like that the House passed a while back, for a while wanted to attach that to the FAA bill. There's a fight over an extra 5 slots landing at DCA Airport. But if you don't get a unanimous consent agreement to set the stage for these amendments and those amendments, and you just go through the processing of the procedural steps to get to a final vote, you may not get very many amendments at all. So the train appears to be leaving the station without many opportunities for extra legislation because, again, there was this mad scramble to attach more ornaments onto the final Christmas tree. So it looks like there are not going to be many major amendment votes after that major scramble.
Okay, so we'll see when this train ultimately leaves the station next week. Meanwhile, one train that seems like it's going to stay parked is this motion to vacate train that Marjorie Taylor Greene was trying to be conductor of. Earlier today, I asked Congressman Andy Barr whether her effort to vacate the Speaker's chair was as good as dead. And this is what he told me.
Certainly on pause and mercifully so. The last thing that any conservative, self-described conservative should do 6 months ahead of a very consequential presidential election is to vacate the Speaker's office. That would be so counterproductive and certainly not good for the country.
And certainly we've heard messaging similar to that from the former president, Donald Trump. We know that Marjorie Taylor Greene has spent a good deal of time in meetings with Mike Johnson this week. Is she backing off? And if so, what was this all for?
I mean, the answer to the latter question may have been attention. It can politically pay for a hardline conservative to get the spotlight, but in the context of the broader House Republican Conference, their plans for the election, there weren't a lot of members on board here. So she grabbed the spotlight for a little while. The Speaker insisted there was no negotiating happen. This wasn't about getting something in particular onto the bill, the FAA bill, or other negotiations from his point of view. It really has fizzled, and I think that answered it from Congressman Barr, that doing this in the spring of a presidential election year is a lot messier even than it was when they ousted Kevin McCarthy in an off year when they're not getting onto the campaign trail.
All right, Jack Fitzpatrick of Bloomberg Government, thank you so much, as always. Coming up next on Balance of Power, Samara Klar, professor of political science at the University of Arizona, will be here to talk about how voters are viewing former President Trump's criminal trial, as well as what impact asylum action from President Biden could make in border states. That's next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Character does matter. And if you want to put that as your top priority, by all means, that is your choice and you should vote. But what I don't like is a lot of these, there's a few Republicans out there that are saying, well, don't vote. No, if you don't like Trump, if you don't like Biden, just don't vote. There's nothing more un-American than not voting.
That was New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu on this program yesterday. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. Donald Trump's criminal trial in Manhattan is set to resume tomorrow with continued testimony from adult film actress Stormy Daniels. For more on how voters may respond to the salacious details and questions around the character of the former president and current Republican presumptive nominee, I'm pleased to say joining me now is Samara Klar, professor of political science at the University of Arizona. Professor, welcome back to Bloomberg. Thank you so much for joining. We've had a lot of conversation on this program and others about whether or not a conviction ultimately will make the difference for Donald Trump in this election, whether voters will be willing to turn out for him if he is indeed found to be a convicted felon. There also, though, is the question, especially for undecided women in areas like the suburbs, about what testimony of a sexual encounter with a porn star would mean for them. How do you think that demographic is looking at the developments we've seen in the courtroom this week?
Well, in many ways, these are a lot of the same questions that we were asking in 2016 with the Hollywood Access tape and a lot of the stories that came out then. And I think, as always, it's going to depend on what the big issues are for voters and how much they're willing to turn away from character flaws in order to support a party that best represents their views. I mean, we have two major parties here running. They have very distinct policy platforms in many ways. And a lot of Americans want to vote. They maybe don't like either candidate. Maybe they don't like either party. Maybe they don't like Trump as a person. And they have to figure out whether the policies that they support are worth voting for that candidate anyway.
Well, of course, one of those issues and policy issues is abortion, which has been in hyper focus in Arizona after initially the Supreme Court in the state ruled that an 1864 law that would effectively ban abortions in the state, except for in the case of the life of a mother, was enforced. Then we had the state House and Senate overturning that essentially. So where do things stand now on the abortion issue in Arizona specifically, now that that extremely hardline ban is no more, but there is still restriction in place?
Sure, that's a great example of an issue that really has sort of been overshadowing for most Americans, the trials that are going on. I mean, people are really thinking about these huge issues that pertain to their lives. Abortion is a great example. And here in Arizona, it has been all over the media because, as you mentioned, we had the state Supreme Court that ruled a pre-territorial law would be the law in Arizona, which banned all abortions without any exceptions. This is an incredibly unpopular ban. Only 7% of Arizona voters in a recent poll that I administered actually supported that kind of ban. And the state legislature did repeal that ban. Now, I think by repealing the ban, they have potentially lessened the urgency that people were feeling to come out to vote on a ballot measure in November in support of abortion rights. But I think the damage is done a little bit for Republicans in Arizona because abortion is back to the top of everyone's minds. It's back in the papers. And this ballot measure in November is going to be a highly mobilizing issue for a lot of voters here in Arizona and in 10, 11 other states across the country that are seeing similar ballot measures.
Well, and when we consider not just the presidential race in Arizona, what this may mean for likelihood of a swing state going for Donald Trump or Joe Biden, there's also down ballot races in Arizona that are important. Ruben Gallego, the Democrat running against Kari Lake, the Republican, for example. How is this an issue taken away from Gallego that could have made him more likely to defeat Lake in the senatorial race?
Sure. Well, most Arizona voters oppose a ban, and abortion is an issue that tends to benefit Democrats. Now, during that period of time where that ban was in effect, that was a huge benefit for Democratic candidates here in Arizona who could make a compelling argument that they've opposed a ban all along. And we saw Kari Lake and Juan Ciscomani come out to distance themselves from the ban. In many ways, I think the Democrats will continue to campaign on this issue because in Arizona, we still do have a 15-week ban. That's not in line with what most voters seem to want. So I think Democrats like Gallego will continue to campaign on this issue. We saw Kamala Harris out here a few weeks ago, talking about abortion with a lot of local Democratic candidates. Now, the momentum is probably slowed a bit since the legislature did repeal the ban, but it's still very much at the top of people's minds here in Arizona.
Something else that may be top of mind in Arizona, considering it is a border state, are questions around the border and migration. We know that this has been a problem for President Biden. Our understanding is tomorrow he could announce changes to asylum that could make it easier to expel migrants who are seeking asylum. Are those kind of changes on the margin going to be enough, Samara, or is the only thing that will make a difference for President Biden in a swing state in which our polling suggests he is lagging behind Trump going to be much more sweeping executive action?
Yeah, the border has been a real issue for Biden. I mean, no one here in Arizona, really across the country, is satisfied with how either party has been dealing with the border. And of course, in Arizona, it's an issue that people think about every day. Arizona's on the border. Our economy is very much intertwined with trade across the border. And in the polling that I've been doing, 85% of Arizonans say this is a really important issue. Now, I will say that I ask my voters in this poll, what do you care about? Do you care about people coming across the border, or do you care about guns and drugs coming across the border? And I do find that really the primary concern for most voters isn't necessarily immigrants themselves. It's the insecure border that allows for weapons, illegal drugs, and other illegal products coming across the border. But either way, this is a problem for Biden. It makes sense that he's making this such an important issue now that we're in these last final months as the campaign's really heating up. I don't know if it will make an issue, but as make a difference. But as you say, Arizona is a very, very tight race here. Our electoral outcomes are extremely narrow, and so anything could make a difference.
Well, what we have heard from President Biden as well is this notion that it's Donald Trump's fault that a legislative solution to the border couldn't get through. I wonder to what extent voters actually recognize that, or if that is kind of non-consequential when they're considering the reality they're dealing with in real time. Samara Klar from the University of Arizona, always great to have you here on the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, coming up on Balance of Power, we'll focus on the Veep Stakes, Apprentice Edition, and who former President Donald Trump may be eyeing as his running mate this November. Bloomberg Opinion's Nia-Malika Henderson is next on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
There's really not been any conversations. I think everybody's aware of kind of what the short list is, to use your language. Whatever President Trump decides to do when it comes to the vice presidency, I'm going to fully support, because I just want to win and get our country back on track.
That was Republican Congressman Byron Donalds' response yesterday when I asked if he's a candidate for vice president for Donald Trump. Joining me now to weigh in on the Veep Stakes is Bloomberg Opinion's Nia-Malika Henderson. She has a new column out you can find on the Bloomberg terminal or online about this. And you say, Nia, that most presidential candidates are looking for a running mate that adds something to the ticket, but Trump wants someone who won't challenge him or steal the spotlight. So who meets that qualification?
Listen, if I was to bet today, I think it's Doug Burgum, who was in the race. He's the governor of North Dakota. He's sort of a nerdy-looking guy. He's a billionaire, which helps as well. And, yeah, I mean, if I were, he's sort of a late entry into the Veep stakes and the short list. Byron Donalds, I think, is on the list. Obviously, Tim Scott is as well. Those two men, if they were to be picked, sort of the thinking is that they would help Donald Trump with African Americans, with African American men in particular. I think Burgum is maybe more likely than they are because he has more stature, right? If you look at somebody like Byron Donalds, he's a two-term Congress person, and then somebody like Tim Scott, he's fine. He's sort of had an unremarkable record in the Senate, had an unremarkable race for the White House, which is something that Donald Trump sometimes talks about. Like he says, oh, he was okay talking about himself, but he's a great surrogate for me. But it's interesting. A lot of people, when you talk to Republicans, sort of just average Republicans, they do talk about Tim Scott and the sort of strengths he brings, particularly with expanding the demographic tent.
Well, when we're thinking about expanding the demographic tent, though, you didn't mention any women.
Yeah, I did.
Just now.
I don't think it's going to be a woman, right? You think about Kristi Noem, who shot her poor dog, a puppy, and I think
Cricket.
a goat. Yeah, rest in peace, Cricket. and also shot a goat. We don't really mention the goat, but the goat also was killed at the hands of Kristi Noem. She, if you look at all of the reporting on this, she seems to be off the list, and it's not just because of Cricket's death. This sort of happened before that. So I think the other woman who's obviously on the list is somebody like Elise Stefanik, and Donald Trump has said nice things about her. She was at this cattle call over the weekend with all of the VP sort of candidates, the shortlisters. But again, I think she has been in Congress just for a little while. She's a congressperson. And I think if you're Donald Trump, you're looking for either a senator or a governor, somebody who's run something. And I think Burgum obviously fits that. And he's a billionaire. That helps with Donald Trump, who's going to need money to fund this thing.
Just as you mentioned Congress, we have some breaking news this hour. Marjorie Taylor Greene has done it. The Congresswoman from Georgia moves to force a motion to vacate against Speaker Johnson. The House must now act on this within 2 legislative days. In our final minute with you, Nia, Donald Trump didn't seem to want this. He had voiced support for Speaker Johnson. Does a move like this have impacts for him politically?
No, listen, it makes Congress, the sort of Republican part of Congress, look like a mess. It doesn't help this case that they should be in charge and they should be governing. But people saw this coming. It looks like Democrats are going to come to his rescue. Who would have ever thought that would happen? And listen, this is Marjorie Taylor Greene, who bucked Donald Trump. He had a one-on-one with her. He has expressed his support for Mike Johnson. So, she is a bit of a lone wolf at this point. It doesn't look like he's going to, give in to her demands. So here we are again with, what is this, the third time in a year or something where the speaker is in peril. But it looks like he'll survive this. Yeah.
Thanks to Democrats, or maybe in part thanks to Donald Trump. Nia-Malika Henderson of Bloomberg Opinion, thank you so much, as always. Again, Marjorie Taylor Greene has moved on the motion to vacate, asking House Republicans to oust Speaker Mike Johnson. There is no indication, though, that will actually happen. So we'll have more coming up on Balance of Power for you. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Breaking news this evening. Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Congresswoman from Georgia, has done it. Went to the well on the floor of the House and asked for action on her motion to vacate the House Speaker, Mike Johnson. A privilege resolution that would give the House 2 legislative days to act on it. Of course, Democrats have already said they would vote to table this motion, effectively killing it as soon as it begins. But it has, in fact, begun. And joining us now for reaction is our political panel, Maura Gillespie, founder and principal at Blue Stack Strategies, and Jim Kessler, Third Way Executive Vice President. So, Maura, first to you. I thought this effort was dead. I think a lot of us did when it became clear that Democrats were going to back Mike Johnson up if they needed to. It felt like she was backing away. And then this today. Why?
I mean, it's really hard to say what goes through Marjorie Taylor Greene's head, but she clearly, again, does not understand what's at stake here. Her fellow Republicans and most of the conference there booing her on the House floor is evident of that, right? She does not understand the importance of having a unified front. What this does, not only does it create chaos for Congress, for the House, but also it deters donors to want to support the Republican Party, and especially to build their majority. This is counterproductive to that effort, and it's a very self-serving move on her part. Again, she is just on her own island here, and it's disappointing, and that's why you're seeing that reaction from her colleagues. It's not well thought through.
So is this a gift to Democrats, Jim, even though Democrats are going to have to be on the record voting to table a motion to oust a Republican speaker?
Yeah, I think it's a gift. I also think this is like we're now entering some interesting times. And we've already heard some Democrats like Dean Phillips of Minnesota say, I'm going to support the speaker, and Auchincloss of Massachusetts saying it. So, look, Mike Johnson is actually in a stronger place than he was a month ago. This is probably good for him, getting this deal through, standing up to Marjorie Taylor Greene. Yeah, I think it's good for Democrats, but it's also good for him. Nancy Pelosi was for 20 years the leader of the Democrats because she would say to the progressives, I'm one of you, but you don't get this. Mm-hmm. Mike Johnson just did this with the hard conservatives in his caucus. If he's going to survive long term, he's going to have to get used to it.
Well, but my question is about survival long term. Even if he can stick it out with the gavel in hand through the remainder of this Congress, come January, if the House majority is still in the hands of the Republicans and he had to be saved by Democrats, why would the conference reelect him as Speaker?
Who else are they going to elect? I mean, Who else? I just don't know who the other alternative is. So, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene put herself in a cul-de-sac. The reason why this is happening is she couldn't find a way out of the trap she set for herself. And, you know, that's why we're here now.
Okay, so maybe she was just in too deep, Maura, and in so deep that she potentially has to even act in defiance of a former president that she has a relationship with. Former President Donald Trump stood in defense of Mike Johnson, said nice things about him on multiple occasions, by all accounts didn't seem to want this to happen, and she's doing it anyway. What does that potentially signal about her political future?
It shows us that ego is more important than doing what's right for her constituents, for her colleagues, for the Republican majority, and for Donald Trump, quite frankly, because if he's out there trying to run for president, presumably you're trying to also expand your majority, because right now the House is the only section of the government that has Republican control, and they don't have that much leverage to use. Marjorie Taylor Greene does not understand how our government works. I don't think she has any care for or respect for her colleagues. And this just really does show that she is on her own island, as Jim said, in her own cul-de-sac of what is best for her. But this is also just ego. She was in too deep. She had made all these, again, she can't find a camera she doesn't love to get in front of. This is what she does. And unfortunately, her constituents will suffer. The House Republicans will suffer because, again, who's going to want to support a part of the government that's not really doing any work? This is going to set us up for another fight come January. Should the Republicans maintain control of the House, it doesn't bode well for us.
Well, we should hear from the Congresswoman herself in the remarks she just gave on the floor when acting on this motion. Take a listen to Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Speaker Johnson supported fully funding abortion, the trans agenda, the climate agenda, foreign wars, and Biden's border crisis, rather than ensuring liberty, opportunity, and security for all Americans.
So, Maura, she keeps referring to different things that the speaker has done in a bipartisan way, referring to the uniparty. The uniparty and bipartisanship are synonymous here, I guess?
That's what is so frustrating, I think, when it comes to Marjorie Taylor Greene, because in order to get things done, when you only have one part of the government under your control, so you have a Democratic-led Senate, a Democrat in the White House, you only have so much leverage. You can try and use that leverage to get some things into a legislative package that are your legislative wins, but you're never going to get everything that you want. That's just not possible. It's not how the founders created our system of government to work. And unfortunately, she does not realize or understand that or care to understand that. So instead, it's so much easier to complain than it is to lead. And we have seen that with the Freedom Caucus largely. So you see that you have a Thomas Massey behind her and supporting her. That's about it, right? Because it's so much easier to complain than it is to lead. And she is a prime example of that. She'll, complain and lament about what the compromises are. Compromise is a good thing. It's what we should want our leaders to be doing to get things done for us. Even if it's a small step forward, it's a step forward. And she doesn't see that, unfortunately.
All right, Maura Gillespie and Jim Kessler, our political panel this evening, weighing in on all of the domestic political drama. Thank you so much. You'll be sticking with me, but we also have to talk about what's happening in geopolitics. And coming up, Ambassador James Jeffrey, the former ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, will join me with the action the administration is taking, or perhaps not taking, at least at this time, in regard to sending weapons to Israel. We'll have more on that, the implications for Biden in the 2024 race, with our political panel back as well on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's a direct abrogation of their responsibility under the Constitution. The administration does not have the legal authority to just ignore and disregard the will of the American people through their elected representatives in Congress.
We intend to make sure that we keep an eye on the situation. But we need a ceasefire. Israel has a right to defend itself.
I think it's a hugely irresponsible decision. I think at the end of the day, there should never be any question about America's commitment, United States commitment to Israel. And I think Biden's treading on some thin ice there.
The administration, particularly the president, is making it clear to Netanyahu, if you want our assistance, you need to follow our laws.
That was Congressman Andy Barr and Senators Raphael Warnock, Tom Tillis, and Dick Durbin. Their thoughts on the United States' pause of a shipment of bombs to Israel. Joining us now, I'm pleased to say, is Ambassador James Jeffrey, former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey and Wilson Center chair of the Middle East program. Welcome, sir, to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. The U.S.'s justification for pausing at this time this shipment of large bombs is concern about the fact that they may be used in Rafah, a city in Gaza in which more than 1 million Palestinians have sought refuge. Is this decision justified for that reason?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. This is a political decision. The administration, on a second track, has to make a determination of whether Israel is using weapons that we have given them, many billions of dollars of weapons just in this conflict, in a legal way. But this is political pressure because the administration felt that Israel was trying to rush into a major offensive in Rafah, right on the Egyptian border, where the remnants of Hamas and some 1.4 million Gazan citizens are all located, without listening to the administration, which wants a very different kind of campaign, if any at all. So this was political pressure. The point was made, both American officials by Defense Secretary Austin and Israeli officials are trying to play this down. I think this is, at the moment, a one-off because we're now focused on ceasefire negotiations in Cairo. And the Israeli incursion into Rafah so far has not been major. It didn't lead to a lot of civilian casualties, and it actually makes sense militarily by getting control of the Rafah crossing and getting control of the border. And in fact, the American government has said basically that, at least today. We'll see what happens tomorrow.
Well, indeed we will, Ambassador. As you say, this is a political decision for the Biden administration because of political pressure he is facing. Does this not so, too, though, apply political pressure to Benjamin Netanyahu, or more pressure, at least, a show that the U.S. is willing to exercise the leverage that it has to influence Israeli policy and military decisions?
Okay, first of all, when the United States makes sense, as recently when Joe Biden picked up the phone and told Bibi Netanyahu he had to do much more on the humanitarian front, or the threat was exactly what we've done now, limit weapon shipments, Netanyahu complied. The reason is this wasn't central to Netanyahu and the Israeli people's existential fight against Hamas and indirectly against Iran. They could flow more humanitarian aid without unduly affecting their campaign against Hamas. But if the administration thinks that Israel will stop the fight against Hamas when they're essentially at the last stage of it, as the current Israeli defense minister has said, we've completed 80% of the job, I think the administration is wrong. What's at the center of this here is administration concern about the political impact in America of civilian casualties. There's no way Israel can fight this war. There's no way we fought wars in Iraq and Syria that I was involved in over the past 20 years in urban areas without considerable civilian casualties. It's a reality. But the administration wants to avoid the political heat. The problem is nobody in the administration has explained to me or the American people or the Israelis how this all ends if Hamas, with some 5,000 to 10,000 soldiers, remains in control of that critical crossing, that critical area of Gaza with some 1.4 million Gazans.
Okay, well, on the subject, Ambassador, of how this all ends, the question about when it ends or if it could end in the not-so-distant future is what really is at the center of negotiations around a ceasefire. Hamas would like that ceasefire to be permanent. Israel would not. They want it to be temporary and still be able to exchange some hostages that are currently being held by Hamas, but they ultimately do want to finish the job. When the divide between what the two sides want is that big, how optimistic are you that they are able to bridge that gap?
Well, that's the problem. And there was certain decisions taken by the intermediaries, the U.S., Egypt, and the state of Qatar, with Hamas over the last few days that led Hamas to believe that they had a deal that would end the fighting for good. And that's what the Israelis have rejected. They then went into Rafah again in a limited way, and now they're back negotiating. But again, the administration has to clarify this. I'm not even sure they've clarified it to themselves. They talk about rebuilding Gaza. They talk about putting the Palestinian Authority in there, building a new Middle East. But if Israel leaves Gaza and Hamas is left with, as I said, 5,000 to 10,000 fighters and thus control of it, Israel has lost this war. And Israel, not just Netanyahu, but the people, for very good reason, do not want to lose this war. So there's a real break in communication right now between the Biden administration and Netanyahu. They're trying to fix it, but you can't fix it without coming to some conclusion on this crucial point of the whole war.
Well, if we could expand upon that, sir, when we think about what the day after looks like, whenever that day ultimately is, your point is well taken that perhaps what the administration would like to see put in place in the Middle East would not actually be realistic if Hamas were still to be existing and operating in Gaza, not totally eliminated. But is it a question of whether or not Hamas is still in power in some areas or whether Benjamin Netanyahu is still in power? Because he has repeatedly pushed against the idea of a two-state solution at the end of this.
Right. And there the administration has to be tough because that reflects Netanyahu's current political position. It's not an existential question for the Israeli people on whether they want to continue down the road of a two-step solution, which they have off and on done for the last 30 years, including under Bibi Netanyahu. And he was in discussions with the United States and indirectly with Saudi Arabia on the 6th of October, up until then, on how that could happen. So it could happen, and the administration should put pressure on him for that. That is absolutely legitimate. But again, if Hamas is in control in Gaza, there is no two-state solution. There is no reconstruction of Gaza. There's no future for the people there, and there's very little future for the security of the region, I fear.
All right, Ambassador, always great to have you here on Bloomberg. Thank you so much for joining me. That's former Ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, James Jeffrey. Thank you. Now, a quick update on the breaking news from Capitol Hill this evening. It was within this hour that Marjorie Taylor Greene asked for the House to act on her motion to vacate House Speaker Mike Johnson. Now a vote underway on a motion to table that. Democrats stepping up here as they promised they would to provide votes to table this motion. This would effectively kill the effort on the part of Marjorie Taylor Greene. The gavel has not yet come down, but again, with the assistance of Democrats, the motion to table does have the votes to pass. And Speaker Mike Johnson will keep his job, at least for now. Now, coming up still on Balance of Power, President Biden in Wisconsin today to champion a major Microsoft investment into the swing state. We'll have more with our political panel next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
administration promised a $10 billion investment by Foxconn to build a new manufacturing complex, create 13,000 new jobs. In fact, he came here with your Senator, Ron Johnson, literally holding a golden shovel, promising to build the 8th wonder of the world. Are you kidding me? Look what happened. They dug a hole with those golden shovels, and then they fell into it.
That was President Biden in Wisconsin earlier today on the grounds of a site where Microsoft is making a $3.3 billion investment. The same area where Foxconn's initial plan to invest in the swing state fell through during the Trump administration. Joining us now, I'm pleased to say again, is our political panel, Maura Gillespie, founder and principal at Blue Stack Strategies, and Jim Kessler, Third Way Executive Vice President. So, Jim, is this the formula? Go to a swing state, try to draw a direct contrast between yourself and the man you're running against in November, and also tie it, or try to tie it specifically with legislation that you've passed that you are having difficulty having voters recognize you did?
Yeah, I think it's some meat and potatoes campaigning going on in a very important swing state. And a new poll just came out that showed that Joe Biden is up 6 points in Wisconsin. I wouldn't believe that poll. I think Joe Biden is behind in this presidential race, and behind in those blue wall states of Wisconsin, Michigan and Pennsylvania. He needs to be in a better place in the economy, on the border, on crime. Showing up and doing this in Wisconsin helps.
Okay, so he's referring, Maura, to the Quinnipiac poll that just came out today. Biden up 6 points. The margin of error is 2.6. Do you buy it?
I don't really trust polls entirely. I think, you really don't know what's going to happen. And especially in this election, you really don't know what's going to happen until we get to Election Day, because all it really comes down to is who turns out to vote, who shows up. And I think that this, to Jim's point, don't believe the polls, and the candidates shouldn't either. They should be going out and trying to win over that small percentage of undecideds, those people who are more moderate, but not all of the undecideds are moderate. Some of the undecideds are, kind of on the far right or far left that aren't happy with their presumptive nominees. So this is really going to come down to who can win them over, and I think those issues, of economy, safety, security, border, things of that nature are going to play the biggest roles here.
Okay, so Maura, if your point really is that it comes down to how people actually vote, not necessarily what they say in polls, I wonder what we should make of how Indiana Republican primary voters actually voted yesterday. 22% of them did not vote for Donald Trump. They voted for Nikki Haley, who ended her campaign 2 months ago. What does that say?
That people are dissatisfied with Donald Trump, especially Republican voters who wanted to make sure he knew that they didn't win him over. I think that's a really a telling point there, because, again, just because they are Republicans or maybe they're independents, they're not sure yet, they don't have to vote for Donald Trump. It also doesn't mean that they have to vote for Joe Biden. Those are not our two choices. The candidates themselves have to make the case to those voters as to why they should be selecting them. It's their responsibility, not the voters. And I think that vote, getting 20%, that's a sign of, we're not here for you, Donald Trump, and you need to tell us why we should be.
Okay, well, Jim, Maura raises the idea that those aren't just the only two choices. There are third parties to factor in here, not no labels, which I know Third Way was heavily involved in quashing. But RFK Jr. is still out there. He this week challenged Donald Trump to a debate at an event later this month. We have gotten some reporting out of the New York Times that he may have a dead parasite in his brain that apparently ate part of it, perhaps some medical concerns here. But how should we be viewing the RFK threat?
So RFK is not going to win the presidency. He's not going to come close. He will probably end up in single digits out there. And the question is, the votes that he takes, are they going to be mostly votes that would have gone to Joe Biden or votes that would have gone to Donald Trump? Right now, I think it's a jump ball. There are parts of Trump's records that appeal to the MAGA right. There's part of his history and certainly his name that appeals to Democrats. I don't think the worm story helps him, and not just because it's bizarre, but it's in a deposition about a divorce in which he is trying to make sure that his ex-wife doesn't get money. And it's part of a history of his that's kind of grifting and treating women poorly, and I think Democrats will take advantage of that.
Well, and it wasn't just the parasite. He also talked about excessive seafood consumption that could have triggered mercury poisoning. He said he had cognitive issues like short-term memory loss. So perhaps we have to consider all of that here as well. And your point is well taken that he may not get a large share of the vote. But if he gets enough in a state like Michigan, where he's on the ballot, where Trump and Biden are close, that could be the difference maker.
Absolutely. I mean, look, you talked about no labels. If they gotten on the ballot, it would have been devastating for Joe Biden. Robert F. Kennedy, I think it started out as being devastating for Joe Biden. The Biden side has gotten the jump in this, in defining RFK as being sort of MAGA adjacent crank. So Trump has tried to catch up.
All right, Jim Kessler and Maura Gillespie, thank you both so much for joining me this evening and dealing with our breaking news. Marjorie Taylor Greene triggering the motion to vacate, and it has been quashed. The motion to table on the House floor succeeded. Mike Johnson will keep his job, at least for today. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.